Okay, hello. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this pre-Arctic Sea Ice Day celebration. I am Emily Ringer, and I am coming to you from the Polar Bears International House in Churchill, Manitoba. Can you still hear me? Okay, great. Looks like you can still hear me. And I'm here with Marisa Kraus, or virtually with Marisa Kraus, and she is coming to us from Columbus, Ohio. And today we want to talk just a little bit about polar bears, a little bit about Arctic sea ice, and a little bit about the role that we can all play in minimizing the greatest harms of climate warming and protecting the people, the ecosystems, and the places that we care about most. So if you have any questions during this live chat, please feel free to either post them on our social channels. You can send us a tweet or put it as a comment, or feel free if you're watching this on our website you can use the chat feature there, and we will get back to them either during this broadcast or shortly after. So now I'm going to bring in our special guest, our most esteemed and special guest, a chunk, and we have Dakota, our intern here, is bringing it over, a chunk of real, thank you, Dakota, you rock, of real Arctic sea ice. So not sure if everyone can see this. Yes, it looks like we can. So this is from Hudson Bay. This house is located, I'll set it down for a second and bring it back up in a minute. This house is located near the shores of Hudson Bay, and this is a seasonal sea ice ecoregion. So that means that every fall and winter, the sea ice reforms and the polar bears go out on the sea ice. The sea ice melts in the summertime and the polar bears come onto land and they fast until that sea ice reforms and they can get back out onto the sea ice. So if you were to be looking at the shores of Hudson Bay right now, you would see some chunks of sea ice kind of bobbing in the water near to the shore. And then if you were to squint really hard and look, you can see a thin white line just on the horizon of the ocean, and that is the remaining larger leads of sea ice on the bay. And there's still some polar bears out there right now getting their final meals before they come on shore for the remainder of the summer and a portion of the fall until the sea ice refreezes. So this chunk of ice brings us to our very first fact. And my favorite fact, actually, I'm going to just tilt it down a little bit so we can see the ice. So my favorite of our sea ice facts, and that is that this chunk of ice is a lot more than frozen water. It's much more complex and it supports a tremendous amount of life. So sea ice is actually the base of the entire Arctic food chain. And as you can maybe see, or maybe you could see before I tilted the camera on the wall behind me, we like to say that sea ice is to the Arctic ecosystem as soil is to the forest. It is truly that important to this ecosystem. And you might wonder, so how can this chunk of frozen water support or create life? And that's a really good question. When salt water, so sea ice is on the ocean and the sea. So when salt water freezes, it expels salt. And as the salt moves out of the frozen ice or the freezing water, this creates little channels. And now you might not be able to see it, but I can see all these little channels in this ice here. And when the sunlight filters through the sea ice, it creates the opportunity for algae to live and thrive on and in the sea ice. And algae is the base of the ecosystem. Here, I'll move over here. So if you can see behind me, we have this food web. Algae on the base of the sea ice is the base of the ecosystem that ends up bringing us all the way up to polar bears and to people. It feeds this entire space. And so oh, excuse me, we have a fan on because it's kind of hot and it's a little bit dusty. So you can see that sea ice is much more than just a platform. It is in fact an underwater garden, an upside down underwater garden that is the base of the total Arctic marine ecosystem. And now we're going to move on to our second fact, and I am going to pass it over to Marisa.
That one. Hey, Emily, Maurice's having some technical issues. Go ahead and take it away, and we'll bring her back in when we can.
No problem. I realized that I got started. I was so excited about this ice and about talking about sea ice that I didn't necessarily mention why we are doing this, which is because Arctic Sea Ice Day is tomorrow, and that's July 15th. And because it is on July 15th, we decided that we could talk about sea ice and polar bears through the context of 5 cool facts about sea ice and then the one thing that you can do to help it. Because as the climate is changing and warming around the globe, we are seeing less and less sea ice, and that is the ecosystem that polar bears depend on. And it's, as you will hear from the remaining facts, it's an ecosystem that we actually all depend on. So I can maybe I'll take the next fact from Marisa as she gets going, but I kind of gave it away, and that's that polar bears rely on sea ice to efficiently catch their main seal prey. So polar bears are actually classified as marine mammals. They want to be on the sea ice. That is their home. And that's where the seals live. Hence why the polar bears like to be there. So polar bears will use sea ice as a platform to hunt seals. Polar bears are really good swimmers, but they're not as good of a swimmer as seals, so they're not necessarily going to catch a seal in open water. So polar bears will use the surface of the sea ice to stalk and hunt their seal prey. They have a great sense of smell, and when the seals come up to their breathing holes or around their dens, that's when polar bears are most likely to find them. And without this platform, so we've established that sea ice is first and foremost, it's the substrate that the entire Arctic ecosystem depends on. And secondarily, it's a platform that polar bears need in order to catch seals. And polar bears, they're opportunistic eaters. They might munch on something when they are on land, but it's not necessarily going to have the calorie content that these bears need. They are really designed to eat high fat meals, and that is what a seal is. There's a tremendous amount of blubber in a seal, and that is what polar bears are looking for, and that's what their bodies have evolved to survive off of. And we just don't see anything on land that necessarily has that kind of high fat content that could sustain a population of polar bears in the long term. So polar bears need this ice chunk. And I can move on to our third fact, unless I hear anything about Marisa coming through. Maybe not, so I'll keep going. Okay, so we have obviously established that polar bears need sea ice. This is very important to them. It's important to uh, a lot of Arctic marine life and other wildlife around the Arctic, but it's also very important to people. So for people that are living in the north, sea ice serves as an important platform for transportation, and sea ice also gives access to really important sources of food. And sea ice matters to people that are living all over the world and all over the planet. Whether or not you're getting your food from it or using it to transport, we are all impacted by sea ice. And that is because sea ice acts as, we like to call it, our global air conditioner. So because it is bright and white, sea ice reflects incoming sunlight and heat off of the surface back into space. And that keeps our climate in a stable rhythm, and that keeps our planet relatively more cool. And I'm not sure if we have any Marisa yet, but I can also keep going with the facts. Okay, I'll keep going. So on that topic, sea ice is, we'll call this our fourth fact about sea ice. It's declining in both extent and thickness around the Arctic because of human caused climate change. And as we established in that first fact, this is an entire ecosystem. So that means that the base of this ecosystem is declining, and also our shield. You put up those shields sometimes in the inside of your car windows and they reflect the light out and keep the inside of your car cool. That's a lot of what sea ice is doing for us here. So as that's declining in thickness and extent, that can cause global impact problems. Um, we like to think that, or we like to use the analogy that when we oh, I can see Marisa right now. So maybe I'll let Marisa come in because I was just about to talk about heat trapping blankets. Can you hear me,
Awesome. So
Marisa?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I was just talking about fact number 4, and feel free to take it away, and I'll keep showing my ice chunk.
Okay, great. We know that Arctic sea ice is declining in both extent and thickness due to human caused climate warming. So, you see, it's important to remember that when we burn fossil fuels for energy, like coal, oil, and natural gas, we release what's called dioxide into the atmosphere. And that carbon dioxide acts like a blanket, trapping too much heat around our planet that would have otherwise escaped. And that's melting Arctic sea ice and ultimately disrupting.
Are you still there, Marisa?
Oh, I lost you there for a minute. Were you able to get that? I truly apologize for all my technical difficulties.
That's okay. It's the way of the world. We're
Right.
connecting from far away in all angles, so it's no big deal. I don't think there's anybody watching who hasn't seen technical difficulties. So,
Right.
we did. Yeah, I think got most of what you were saying.
And-
Okay,
Okay,
great.
great.
So I'm going to take it to our fifth and final fact, and then we're going to come to the true crux of this chat, which is what we can all do about the situation we're discussing. So this fifth and final fact is that as sea ice declines because of climate warming, that means that more and more heat is being absorbed into the ocean. And because there's less sea ice ultimately to reflect that heat away and back into space. And we like to think about the ocean as the climate's heart. So if you think about your own heart in a human body and what that does for your body, it circulates your blood and it keeps a stable body temperature in the body consistently. And the ocean is much the same, honestly, for the entire planet. So the ocean circulates moisture, it circulates heat, and it circulates nutrients around the planet. And when that system gets disrupted, say by adding more heat into the system, then we start to see global impacts and global implications. And disruptions to that system will ultimately result in things like more frequent and more extreme weather events. But although this can feel like a lot of heavy news for the Arctic ecosystem and for all of us that depend on a stable climate, it is not a hopeless situation. There are things that we can actually do to impact this trajectory and to protect polar bears and people. So now I'm going to hand it over to Marisa to answer this most important question, which is what can we do about all of this?
Great. Thanks, Emily. Everybody's good. You can still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, we've talked about why sea ice is so important, and we know that it's a habitat that many species depend on across the circumpolar north and that it's at risk. But the good news is that we know what the problem is, and therefore we can point to the correct solutions to the problem. And we know that ultimately we must transition to a renewable energy future. And we know that changing systems and changing where our energy from is coming from is going to be, it's going to take all of us. And so there's one thing that we'd like to talk about today, that everyone can start to do, or rather continue to do if you're already doing it. And so we'd like you all to talk about it. We'd like you to share your concern for polar bears and Arctic sea ice. See, what we know is that we can't solve a problem we don't understand, and we can't understand the issue if we aren't talking about it. And as communicators, we have the opportunity to speak about climate change and its impacts on polar bears consistently, and to have a conversation that is positive, civic and community minded, and also solutions focused. So, when we say that we want you to talk about polar bears and climate change, that means we want you to talk about it with your community. So, who's your community? It's your peers, your teammates. You can share that you support a swift transition to renewable energy options with your civic leaders. You can mobilize a community that shares your same concern. And you can participate in government and attend local meetings. And those are all great ways to speak up and talk about it. Now, also, when we say talk about it, we really want to share the core story of polar bears and climate change and sea ice loss in the Arctic. And so we're going to start off with a value, and we're going to share why it's important, and that it's important to protect habitats that animals and people ultimately depend on. When we move to the how it works piece, so here we know that if somebody understands how something works, they're better poised to identify the correct solutions to the problem, like the burning of fossil fuels for energy and transitioning to renewable energy sources for climate change. And we found great help in the work that we do with NOCI, which is the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. And NOCI, with the help of the Frameworks Institute, has a set of tested metaphors. And these metaphors are really meant to be explained in 60 seconds or less. And it's something that is meant to diffuse the complicated science of climate change into something more familiar and recognizable to the general public. And so that's where you heard me earlier reference the heat trapping blanket. You heard Emily reference the ocean as the climate's heart. There's a couple other in the toolbox there, and we can certainly share the link to our Arctic Sea Ice Day toolkit in the chat, which I believe also has some of those tested metaphors in it as well. And then lastly, the last part of the core story is to share how we can improve the situation. And so we do that through a series of 3 focuses: through an energy shift, which means moving from a system of the past, from one that burns fossil fuels for energy, to the energy system of the future, a renewable energy future that more sources of our energy come from the wind, sun, and water. Now, secondly, in the meantime, we can also use much, much less of the types of energy that burn fossil fuels. And that we can do through energy efficiency programs. And then lastly, you'll see that last nugget there, which is what we've been focusing here on our solutions piece, is to talk about it. And just recently, one of my colleagues shared with me a graphic from the Yale Communications research that was really inspiring, and that said, the research shows that family and friends are among the sources of information about global warming that registered voters, in the US at least, trust the most across the board of all demographics of registered voters. So we really encourage you to get out there and have more productive conversations. Now, lastly, I'm going to share here, there's different ways to talk about it, right? Whether we're having productive conversations with families and friends and peers, but we can also just share other ways to inspire people to care about the Arctic. And so I'd like to share one opportunity with you here. We've got our explore.org Beluga Cam now live for the summer months in the Churchill River estuary. And you can tune in tomorrow on Arctic Sea Ice Day with us for a live camp kickoff with Beluga Cam operator Kyra McIver live in Churchill at 9:45 a.m. Central Time. We hope you'll join us. And again, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Apologies for the technical difficulties. We hope that we provided you a little bit more information on hopefully how to feel more comfortable having these conversations. Of course, we have some additional links in the chat. And thank you for celebrating with us.
Yes, thank you for celebrating, everyone. And we hope everyone stays cool for Arctic Sea Ice Day.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.